Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. You know what? I feel like I need a little more variety around here, so today I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to talk somewhat in depth about Streets of Rage 2 and what makes it, in my opinion, the best scrolling beat 'em up in the entire history of the genre. To take an in-depth look at what makes Streets of Rage 2 so great, we need to take a quick little tour through the history of the genre. So I'll be taking a very fast look at several of the most pivotal scrolling beat 'em ups ever made. Obviously, I can't talk about every scrolling beat 'em up ever made in this video, so if you have a favorite that's not included, well, sorry about that. I'm trying to limit this video to the trendsetters, the games that really defined or advanced the whole genre. Alright, let's get on with it. Now, I'm not going to definitively point to one single title and identify it as the progenitor of the entire scrolling beat 'em up genre. Instead, we'll talk about a few different titles, starting with IREM's 1984 classic, Spartan X, which is perhaps better known to most as Kung Fu Master. Now, I've covered multiple versions of this game before, and in it we control Thomas as he fights his way through a bunch of thugs to save his girlfriend Sylvia. Depending on the level, we either scroll right to left or left to right, but Thomas only walks on a single horizontal plane and has a fairly limited moveset. He can punch, kick, jump kick, crouch punch, and crouch kick. Each level ends with a unique boss fight. The arcade original was fun, and it looked great for when it came out, and there were some pretty decent ports of it to home platforms like the Commodore 64 and NES. For many fans of the genre who grew up in the 80s, this was likely the first scrolling beat 'em up game they played. There were plenty of others that were similar, but we can talk about those another time. Now, as popular and fun as Kung Fu Master was, it doesn't 100% fit the mold of a modern scrolling beat 'em up since it takes place on a single horizontal plane and doesn't feature any vertical movement, something that became a staple of the genre. But it's undeniable Kung Fu Master and some other games like it set the stage for what was to come. What you're looking at right now may seem both oddly familiar, yet very different. This is Nekketsu Koa Kunio-kun, the original Japanese version of the game we in the West better know as Renegade. This was developed by Technos in 1986 and furthered the genre a little bit, but still didn't quite have all the common elements in place just yet. It does have the vertical movement, but each level is essentially an arena where you have to take out a set amount of thugs before a boss comes out. Kunio-kun/Renegade had left and right attack buttons as well as a jump button. You could punch, kick, grab enemies, pin them down and punch them, and even throw them down pits, and really, what's more fun than doing that in a beat 'em up? You could also grab enemies and do some in-close attacks, including kneeing them and throwing them. The nascent genre is really starting to take shape with Renegade, even though we still aren't quite at the mold of the modern beat 'em up just yet. And there are pretty good ports of Renegade on multiple computer and console platforms. Here's the Sega Master System version of Renegade that you may not have even known existed. There were several home computer console only sequels to Renegade, but honestly, I don't really think they're worth discussing. I know this may sting to some of my European friends who love Target Renegade, and all I can say is,
I'm deeply sorry.
Technos did make several games in this series, which included stuff like Dodgeball and River City Ransom. Every once in a while, a game comes along that sort of transforms the industry and becomes the poster boy for a whole new genre. A year after Technos released Renegade, they released just such a game. I speak, of course, of the absolute classic genre-defining title from 1987, Double Dragon. It's hard to convey just how much I played this game back in the day. For a while, I literally played it every day at the pizza place a couple of blocks away from my house. Double Dragon utilized a 3-button control interface along with a standard joystick. It had buttons for punch, kick, and jump. The game takes place over 4 missions and 1 submission, and it hits so many gameplay elements so perfectly that it would be imitated countless times for many years to come. And this is the first game where we really have to stop and think about what makes one of these games good. And in the case of Double Dragon, I think it's really down to the impact and the interaction that you have with the enemies. And of course it also had the 2-player mode, which never hurts. Now, Double Dragon is admittedly a bit of a technical mess in some ways. The arcade game runs practically in a constant state of slowdown, and sometimes it'll just haphazardly speed up, which can lead to some bad, though hilarious, situations. Still, Double Dragon got an awful lot right as far as presentation and gameplay are concerned. It had a gritty, rundown urban environment, missions that seamlessly blended together, the music composition was great, even if some of the instruments were a bit harsh, and the game was just an enthralling experience from start to finish, and it was made even more so if you played it with a second player. Double Dragon focused on fighting and navigating the environment. As for the fighting, you had a basic punch combo, a basic kick combo, jump kicks, a spinning jump kick, the infamous elbow smash, a headbutt, and you could grab opponents and either knee them in the face or throw them over your shoulder. When it comes to environments, you could climb ladders, fences, in a particular rock face, you could jump up platforms, you could fall in holes or knock enemies into them, you could fall in the water or knock enemies into it, and in the final level you had to avoid enemy traps like bricks that would rapidly jut out, knocking you over, or spears held by particularly stabby statues. On top of all that, the game included weapons you could pick up like baseball bats, ones you could throw like knives and dynamite, and then large objects you could pick up and throw like oil drums, crates, and boulders. For those last three items, you could also kick them, which would either cause them to roll or slide along the ground, knocking any enemies over in their path. Now really, Double Dragon had an impressive amount of variety for when it was released, and that's why it remained the gold standard of the genre for years, and is still recognized as a classic today. Other than the aforementioned technical issues, there's a little bit of wonkiness with the collision detection on some moves, and between characters in the backgrounds. Another element that you really had to start noticing in games like Double Dragon was the enemy AI, and while no one's going to accuse them of being geniuses, they at least worked in a compelling way that made them fun to take on. Now, versions of Double Dragon were released for loads of home computers and video game systems, and most of them are notoriously awful cash grabs like this terrible Amiga version. That game disappointed a lot of people, and I played through the entire farce in an episode of my Complete Trash series if you're a masochist and want to see the entire sad affair from start to finish. The best contemporary versions were definitely those for the NES and then Sega Master System in that order. I've already done some comparison and discussion between the two 8-bit console versions in another video, which I'll also link in the description. Now before we move on from Double Dragon, I want to talk about its sequels. Now I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those sequels, but they should at least be mentioned. Double Dragon 2 hit the arcades about a year after the original. It feels more like a DLC since it recycles a lot of material from the first game, sometimes with just minor graphical changes. However, the gameplay is different, and pretty much worse in every way, mainly due to Technos adopting the Renegade control scheme for it. Yes, instead of the punch, kick, and jump buttons from the original Double Dragon 2 in the arcade changed the buttons to attack left, attack right, and jump. It's not a terrible game, but it's definitely worse than the original. Most of the home versions were actually pretty decent this time around, and the very different NES version, which I'd say is good but not great, is absolutely beloved. Now, Arcade Double Dragon 3 released in 1990, and is pretty much digital garbage. It has incredibly choppy movement in some directions, and is riddled with actual microtransactions. If you wanted things like power-ups, new moves, extra characters, or other goodies, you had to insert quarters and buy them with real money. The control scheme of the original game was restored with buttons for punch, kick, and jump. Some of the moves were carried over and some new ones were added. Now, most of the home versions are reasonable ports of this bad game, but the NES version, as with every NES Double Dragon, does its own thing, and I'd say it's the best Double Dragon 3 there is. It's also the version of the game that gave us the infamous Bimmy and Jimmy quote, so what a treasure. Super Double Dragon hit the SNES in 1991. This was a game that I personally found to be hugely disappointing. It was slow, plodding, and very choppy with very small characters. Still, it did do some interesting things from a gameplay standpoint, such as adding some defensive moves, which are pretty cool, like grabbing an enemy's arm when they punch you, holding it, and then kicking or backhanding them while they can't move. There are also some other new moves and controls, but nothing else it introduced is super compelling. On top of that, the graphics were subpar, the levels were overly long, the sound and music weren't great, and the gameplay was just humdrum. Also, a note, depending on the region of the game, some of the music is different. After Double Dragon, the next big game to hit in this genre was really Sega's Golden Axe in 1989. Some people may consider this a hack-and-slash game rather than a true beat-em-up, but to those people I say, well, you're wrong! Golden Axe is essentially a fantasy Double Dragon where you always have a weapon, but you still also have blunt attacks like hitting enemies with the hilt of your sword or axe, kicking them, shoulder slamming them, and more. This game also has a similar level of background interactivity to Double Dragon, along with some minor platforming elements. Golden Axe was a big step forward for the genre in terms of graphics and sound. Running on Sega's System 16 arcade hardware, it didn't have any of the slowdown that plagued Double Dragon. In terms of gameplay, Golden Axe was like a faster, more intense Double Dragon. It kept the two-player simultaneous action from that game, each attack was smooth with a satisfying impact, the collision detection was excellent, and the moveset was pretty varied for a game with just a single attack button. Arcade Golden Axe had buttons for attack, jump, and magic. The more filled up the magic meter is at the time you press it, the stronger the magic unleashed. Now, Golden Axe took place over 5 varied fantasy locations with a decent roster of enemies and bosses, even though it did employ a lot of palette swaps for basic enemies. Speaking of enemies, they had pretty varied and distinct behaviors in this one. The game also added rideable creatures with their own attacks that were sort of the equivalent of weapons in a normal brawler like Double Dragon. Golden Axe was brought home to several consoles and home computers with varied results. The Genesis version in particular was a great early-ish game for the system. However, the combat was slower than its arcade counterpart, enemy behavior was different, and it just didn't quite match the production values of the original. But really, that was to be expected because of the game's tiny cartridge size of 512 kilobytes or 4 megabits. Despite the small cartridge size, Sega did also add an extra level and an extra boss encounter that was really just a souped-up version of Death Adder. But this came at the expense of trimming a screen or two off the beginning of a few earlier levels. The Genesis/Mega Drive in particular saw 2 more Golden Axe titles, Golden Axe 2 and Golden Axe 3. Golden Axe 2 in particular is a bit of a retread of the original, with new areas, enemies, and characters, but the gameplay was sped up a bit, and in that way it felt a little more akin to the arcade original, but it's still nowhere near as good as that arcade version. It does also up the number of enemies on screen and the size of some enemies. It does have very weak digitized voices when characters die, and that certainly didn't help matters. Golden Axe 3 is a notoriously ugly game that came out at a time when Genesis games had gotten incredibly impressive. This lagged way behind its contemporary brethren. It's not a terrible game, but it looks like a game that came out years before its 1993 release date would indicate. In the US, we didn't even get a retail release of this title. It was only available in the US via the Sega channel. Now, it feels a lot different than the other Golden Axe games on the system, but it's really not that bad. It's not great, but it's worth playing. Now, Golden Axe had a beat-em-up arcade-exclusive sequel released in 1992 called Golden Axe: The Revenge of Death Adder. This game is beloved by many, who laud it as one of the best beat-em-ups ever made. And to those people, I say,
well, you're wrong!
This was so important that I busted out Captain Tennille twice in this episode. Seriously, if you love the game, hey, that's fine, enjoy it. But I don't think it's even close to the original in terms of play mechanics. I'll talk about The Revenge of Death Adder in detail another time. But for today, suffice it to say, I think it's really overrated, and despite its technical advantages, the moves lack satisfying impact, and the play mechanics just feel a bit awkward. Having said that, I would have bought a Saturn port if Sega had bothered to bring it over, so at least there's that. Let's drop back to 1989 when Capcom released Final Fight into the arcades on their CPS-1 hardware. Final Fight looked like a game that was made 4 years in the future that someone sent back through a time warp to 1989. It looked utterly incredible, with gigantic player and enemy sprites, and the players in particular featured incredibly fluid animation. Final Fight only used 2 buttons, attack and jump, and you could press them together for a health-draining but effective spinning crowd control move. And I have to say, I love this game. Final Fight is amazing. I still play it several times a year to this day, but I'd say it's still only the second best scrolling beat-em-up ever made. As far as gameplay in Final Fight goes, it featured a fairly impressive repertoire of moves considering it also only had one attack button like Golden Axe. Characters had a basic punch or punch and kick combo, a jump kick, a separate downward thrust jumping kick, and they could grab enemies and then either knee them or throw them. Also, when you're knocked down, you may not even know this, but you can wiggle the joystick real fast and press the buttons really quick to get up faster. The thing with Final Fight is, it really made the impacts of punches and kicks feel significant, and it really nailed the concept of using enemies as weapons so you could throw one enemy into groups of others and knock them down and force them all to take some damage. It encouraged damaging multiple enemies simultaneously, which several other games in the genre didn't even allow to happen. Speaking of enemies, the arcade version of Final Fight throws an insane number of enemies on screen at once. I'm pretty sure I've counted at least 10 on the final level. And Final Fight also sort of brought the intensity of a shooter or shmup to the scrolling brawler genre. You were always kind of getting attacked and surrounded and having to deal with things very quickly. Final Fight remains one of the absolute best examples of the genre to this day, and I think rational people could make the argument for Final Fight being the best scrolling brawler ever. And if it wasn't for Streets of Rage 2, I'd agree with them. Final Fight arrived home on the nascent SNES/Super Famicom in what was a pretty compromised port. I still liked it a lot, but it cut a level, it cut Guy as a playable character, it replaced Poison and Roxy with these extremely weird little skinny dudes, and it only allowed for one player and a max of 3 enemies on screen at once. Now it was still pretty impressive looking and colorful for when it came out, but it was nowhere near the arcade version, and the low-res new graphics of the SNES version were pretty blocky in comparison to the arcade original, but the colors are definitely really nice. Final Fight also had 2 SNES-only sequels, 1993's Final Fight 2, which is more like an apology and a disappointment than a game. It's an apology because it allowed 2-player simultaneous play and featured 3 playable characters. And in a lot of ways, it almost feels like a reskinned version of the original, since it didn't really contribute any significant new gameplay mechanics to the mix. However, the new characters, especially the enemies, look terrible. The music is awful, and the actual fighting mechanics feel much worse than the original. It's not a good game, and if anything, it feels like a cheap knockoff of the original. It also only featured one returning character, Mike Hager. Now, it's still a lot better than tripe-like rival Turf, but it's not good. Final Fight 3, which came out in 1995, is a little bit better and takes a few cues from Capcom's Mighty Street Fighter series, incorporating new special moves and a super meter. It included Hager and Guy as returning characters, along with 2 new characters. It also allows for an AI-controlled second player if you want. Final Fight 3 is definitely a better game than Final Fight 2, but it's still not one that I particularly enjoy, to be honest. Playing it feels a bit like a chore, even though it is markedly better than the game that came before it. So let's step back to the original Final Fight and talk about the home versions for a sec. Final Fight arrived on multiple consoles and home computers of the era. They ranged from god-awful to pretty great. The Western computer versions were atrocious garbage. The Japanese exclusive X68000 version was the closest match to the arcade original, but definitely was not arcade perfect. The Sega CD version, named Final Fight CD, was far and away the best version we got in the West prior to emulation, featuring all the characters, all the levels, a new Red Book audio version of the soundtrack, and expanded opening and ending cutscenes along with an extra play mode. The dithered, washed-out graphics were a bit on the ugly side though, and don't even comment with some nonsense like, you couldn't see dithering on a CRT TV. I always get those comments, but unless your TV was garbage, you absolutely could see the dithering. It didn't always seamlessly blend like some people would have you believe. I lived through playing this stuff on CRT TVs when it was all brand new, and dithering does not magically disappear on them. Before we get to the main event, we have to talk about the first Streets of Rage. Back when Streets of Rage came out in 1991, right around the same time as the SNES release of Final Fight, it received tons of love from the gaming press, who generally reviewed it very favorably and much more so than SNES Final Fight. EGM's review of Final Fight, when averaged amongst its 4 reviewers, is 7.25 out of 10. EGM's review of the first Streets of Rage in the same issue, by the way, was 9 out of 10. And for those who accuse me of being in the tank for Sega, and it's usually the PC Engine fans, get ready for this. EGM mostly got this one wrong, I think. SNES Final Fight is a better game than the first Genesis Streets of Rage. Why? Streets of Rage basically took Final Fight's gameplay and even loaded the game with similar enemies and stuff, but all the enemies are very small. They're much more akin to the size of characters in Double Dragon than Final Fight. The character movement is very sluggish, especially when you're moving diagonally. The levels are all single set affairs, meaning you just continue in one direction from the start of a level to the end of it. There's no change in scenes to break things up, and also the frame rate is surprisingly low. So why did it get such great reviews? Well, because it had a few things Final Fight SNES didn't. First, it had 3 selectable characters, and then second, it also had a 2-player simultaneous mode. It also had way more enemies on screen than Final Fight, and possibly its #1 feature was the excellent Yuzo Koshiro soundtrack. I'd say there are 4 really great songs in this one, with the rest ranging from pretty decent to very good. Streets of Rage did have a fairly nice moveset, with standard punch and kick combos, a reverse attack, a jump attack, the ability to grab enemies and knee them, finish a knee combo on them, throw them or flip over and then suplex them. The impact of these moves and the responsiveness of the controls dampened the fun with this one a little bit though. You also had a screen-clearing special attack where you called in some cops to rain death on your unsuspecting foes. Now I think the original Streets of Rage, when you get down to it, it's just better than okay. I spent a lot of time playing it, but it's no Final Fight. I would have either given it a 6 or maybe at best a 7. But if it wasn't for this game, we wouldn't have the star of our show coming up right now. Here's Streets of Rage 2. What a difference a year makes. I can't remember the last time I saw such a giant improvement from one game to its sequel in such a short time running on the same hardware. Streets of Rage 2, the reason we're here today, was just an absolutely amazing game, and to this day remains my favorite beat 'em up of all time despite some minor flaws. But let's talk about this game and examine what makes it so good, which we can do now that we have a good grasp on some of these earlier genre hits that we looked at first. Now the graphical leap from the first game obviously is astounding. Streets of Rage 2 does not even look like it's running on the same system as the first game. The characters are much larger and much better animated, that includes both the player characters and enemies. Visually, it's still not on par with arcade Final Fight, but you really couldn't ask for much better than this on the Genesis. It was pretty close to what we were seeing in arcades in every way, except for the smaller Genesis color palette. Streets of Rage 2 has 4 characters to choose from, and unlike the first game where each character felt pretty similar, they're much more differentiated this time around. So you get a completely different gameplay experience playing as Max than you do playing as Skate, for example. And when it comes to moves, there are more this time around. Each character has their standard punch or punch and kick combo, the ability to hold the attack button for a moment and release a stronger attack, a reverse attack, the ability to grab enemies, a standing throw or attack, a backwards throw, a physical grab attack, the ability to flip over and do a suplex or backwards throw. Each character has a standing jump attack, a moving jump attack, and a downward jump attack a la Final Fight. And some characters have unique weapon abilities. Then there are the special attacks. First, each character has a forward slide or dash attack executed by pressing forward, then the attack button. The screen clearing cop attack from the first game has been eliminated and replaced with a special attack button that executes a powerful move that also drains your life. However, there are 2 specials for each character. The first is executed when standing still and works pretty much like the crowd control moves from Final Fight. The second special is executed while moving forward and tends to land multiple hits on very close enemies in front of you. That's a lot of gameplay variety for the fighting in this. Streets of Rage 2 also features decent AI with characters that behave differently and do lots of different things based on different situations, like how many people are attacking you at once, what sides of you they're on, and so forth. And on top of that, what we talked about earlier with hits being impactful, Streets of Rage 2 really nails it. Every hit feels significant in some way. And this is not just the animation, it's the sound effects, it's the way the game pauses on certain hits. They really nail the feel of having satisfying combat. Streets of Rage 2 still features 2-player simultaneous play, and it's not unusual to see up to 5 enemies on screen at once. There's also a fair amount of fancy effects like line scrolling and even a section with nearly full-screen software-based rotation. And capping off the presentation as a whole is the masterpiece of a soundtrack composed primarily by Yuzo Koshiro with contributions to 3 songs by Motohiro Kawashima. The music in this game is just so good. It's easily one of the best soundtracks on the entire system. So far you may think this sounds like a good review-style look at the game, but I told you we'd dive a little bit deeper into things, so let's do that. So the number one thing that makes combat in Streets of Rage 2 so satisfying and compelling is the significance of each impact when you hit or are hit by an enemy. We have different pitched hit effects, a brief pause in the action for emphasis on significant hits, and it really makes everything feel important. Doing the standard attack combo is fun enough, but honestly it's probably the weakest element of gameplay because there's a pretty long pause between each attack and a combo. This is something that will be corrected for Streets of Rage 3. But I always found the best way to play this game is to have as much forward momentum as possible. So I do a lot of jumping and downward strikes into combos and then throw or suplex lots of enemies. I do the double forward attacks a lot too. While staying in motion or smoothly moving from one attack to another, Streets of Rage 2 is at its absolute best and is just an incredibly satisfying game to play. And I don't think any other beat 'em up before or since has the same incredible gameplay feel that this one does. And that includes its sequels, unfortunately. Ancient, the company led by programmer Ayano Koshiro and her brother Yuzo Koshiro, kept an arcade cabinet of Street Fighter II in the office and said that it heavily influenced this game, and frankly, it shows in a good way. I always felt like and used to even say back in 1992 and 93 when this game was fresh, that it was like the side-scrolling beat-em-up equivalent to Street Fighter II, and I didn't know until years later that this was intentionally very much that. The game's scenes and scenarios go a long way to providing an appealing atmosphere too. Unlike the original Streets of Rage, this game is broken up into many different scenes like Final Fight, so a level might be comprised of 3 or more sections. Nearly all of them are very memorable, from the city streets, to the bridge, to the baseball stadium, to a beach, and more. The final 2 levels in this game are a bit similar to Streets of Rage 1, taking place in a factory and mansion respectively, but they really show just how far this team came in 1 year, and the improvement is astonishing. It's almost magical, frankly. So to answer the question of what makes Streets of Rage 2 the best beat-em-up ever, it really boils down to the fact that it excels in basically every area. Stylistically, it's the cleanest looking game in the series on the system. The gameplay was a big leap forward for the genre, especially thanks to the variety of both regular moves and special attacks. And aside from these big wins, it also has lots of little details, like these lights that shake whenever you throw or slam an enemy in the stage. The game just had the ultra clean look of a top-tier Sega arcade game, and the only thing that really would have made it better would have been if the system had a larger color palette and more on-screen colors. Finally, as to the gameplay, like I mentioned a little bit ago, having the enemy AI be interesting and varied for each character, and just, a satisfying way to interact with them, with some that block, some that do counterattacks, some that react to your specific moves, it really fleshed this game out and made it feel alive in a way that a lot of other games in the genre just don't. As it stands, to me, Streets of Rage 2 is the best Genesis game there is. Not just the best scrolling beat-em-up on the system. Its level of near perfection is unmatched by any other game in the genre, or even on any contemporary platform at this time. Even though the Genesis lacked the specs to compete with more advanced arcade hardware, Streets of Rage 2, when it came to gameplay, was in my opinion still superior to everything that the arcade had to offer in the genre. There's a reason this game sits at the top of so many Genesis top 10 lists. It's still great today, but it was mind-blowing when it was new. And just as an aside, to save time, I only intended to play the first 2 or 3 levels for recording this video, and I couldn't put this game down. Among all the games I played for this video, this is pretty much the only one that I always finish every single time I play it. I can't even remember any time I ever started it without finishing it. And really, that may say things better than any points I've made in this entire look at the game up to this point. Alright, let's talk about what happened after Streets of Rage 2, just to cap this video off. In 1994, Sega and Ancient unleashed Streets of Rage 3 on the Genesis/Mega Drive. This one reduced the pause between attacks and included new gameplay elements like running, a power meter that lets you use special moves without having them drain your life, and you could power up your dash attacks by several levels by earning stars. Sounds great so far, right? The problem is, this game is a lot uglier than the second entry. It's heavily dithered, and stylistically just doesn't look nearly as appealing as the ultra-clean Streets of Rage 2. The locations in 3 are not nearly as imaginative or as fun as those in the second game either. We start out in a boring warehouse, move on to a badly dithered plain Jane dock area, and the locations mainly just look bland and worse than the distinctive ones from Streets of Rage 2. The US release also messed with the character outfit colors to make them gender neutral, and the over-the-top character Ash, who was a very stereotypical leather-clad, effeminate gay man, was removed from the Western version as well, and really, I can't imagine why they included that character in the first place. I mean, they had to know that wasn't going to fly in the US, where this series was extremely popular. Finally, they also censored some of the outfits for the female enemy characters in this game too. In my opinion, Ancient lost their way a little bit with Streets of Rage 3, and I don't exactly know why. The art direction is worse. The music, again by Koshiro and Kawashima, is mostly terrible, and not in the spirit of the first 2 games in the series at all. There are a few okay songs, but they're the exception in this one. I doubt anyone ever walks around humming Streets of Rage 3 music. Finally, the Western version, it's incredibly difficult. It's way harder than the first 2 games, to the point of just not being fun. All things considered, Streets of Rage 3 was a giant step backwards for the series, and the last new Streets of Rage game we would get for many years. In fact, we wouldn't see another Streets of Rage sequel until Streets of Rage 4's release in 2020. That was more than 25 years after the last game in the series. I was excited when I heard the game was coming, and then I saw what it looked like and I was less excited. And then when I played it, I was even less excited than that. Now, I reviewed this game on the channel after it came out, and I really struggled with the decision on whether I should give it a 6 or a 7. The content of the review itself wouldn't change, but I gave the game a 7 back then, and I think I really should have given it a 6. 6. And why would I give it a 6? First up, I can't even explain how much I hate the graphical style of this game. Instead of the gritty, awesome 16-bit bitmapped characters of the prior games in the series, we get weird-looking color forms in Streets of Rage 4. There are several gameplay regressions. Many of the improvements from Streets of Rage 3 are absent in Streets of Rage 4. The gameplay is way too reliant on juggling, which I find incredibly dumb in games like this. The levels are almost all way too long. A lot of the music is really bland and completely forgettable. The locations aren't particularly compelling either. In fact, after playing through this game multiple times, one of them just a couple of months ago, I literally can't even remember every level in it. This game was a letdown, and I think it's aging badly, and I actually feel that it's getting worse over time. Hopefully the upcoming new Streets of Rage game can restore the style and vibe of the original series, which was seriously lacking in Streets of Rage 4. I should also note that this game has totally soured me on the recently announced Shinobi, which is full of the same inappropriate colorform visual style. I mean, maybe it's just me, but tell me, dear viewers, do any of you find this ultra cartoony look appealing for these games? You know, that had this serious bitmap vibe back in the day? One thing I must include here briefly is a mention of the awesome fan game Streets of Rage Remake, which I'd easily recommend over Streets of Rage 4 at any time. This game, which was shut down by Sega years ago, is still out there on the internet, and just a Google search away, my friends. It contains pretty much every level from the first 3 games, plus new ones, has multiple branching paths, has loads of characters, and lots of unlockable stuff. And more importantly, tons of gameplay options, and is easily the best thing to come out of the franchise since Streets of Rage 2. The graphics and sounds are updated for each entry in the series, there are different versions of the characters from each game in the series, and the Streets of Rage 1 characters and backgrounds have been brought up to the higher standards of the rest of the series. The only thing that slightly lets this one down is some of the enemy AI just isn't right, but on the whole this is absolutely excellent. And if Sega had half a brain, they would have just bought the rights to improve and distribute this game instead of shutting it down when they did. If you're a big fan of Streets of Rage 2 in particular, and haven't tried Streets of Rage Remake, I can only say one thing.
Do it.
Now there are loads more games in the genre, many of which are really good games and worth talking about. The output from Capcom and Konami alone in the genre would merit a much longer video than even this one. From things like Crime Fighters to TMNT to The Simpsons, there's plenty to look at for another time. But as good as the rest of those games are, I think it's undeniable they did not wield the same influence on the genre as the ones that I talked about today. The scrolling beat-em-up, like all genres, has evolved since it first leapt into the gaming scene. From its simple origins with games like Kung Fu Master to classics like Double Dragon and Final Fight, it changed a lot over the years. Most of these games built on what worked in the games that came before them to create something compelling that moved the genre forward in some way. Streets of Rage 2 took tons of what worked so well in the genre in the past and modernized it for 1992. Combining the game with some of the gameplay elements that made Street Fighter 2 such a monster hit was also incredibly savvy at the time. The truth is, there isn't any one thing that made Streets of Rage 2 the incredible game that it is. It's an amalgam of the best elements of the genre with some of the best artwork, music, and gameplay on the entire system. In the end, Streets of Rage 2, in my opinion, remains the pinnacle of the genre, and no other scrolling beat-em-up has been as impressive for the time it was released on the hardware on which it was released. While there are those that will disagree, as with anything in life, consider the time and the market at which this game debuted. Its only console competition at the time were SNES games like Final Fight 2 and Brawl Brothers, which honestly were no competition at all. It's sad that the series itself sloped downward badly after Streets of Rage 2, with Streets of Rage 3 making some gameplay enhancements while backsliding in every other category. Streets of Rage 4 to me was a pretty big letdown that failed to understand the tone of the series as it pertains to both mood and play mechanics. While I'm skeptical the new polygonal Streets of Rage game will advance the genre in any way, I'm willing to be cautiously optimistic about it. Who knows, maybe it'll surprise us all just like Streets of Rage 2 did. Now, it's your turn. Tell me, what did you think of Streets of Rage 2? Do you agree with me? Do you think I'm nuts? I want to hear all about it in the comments. And that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss any of my videos. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon, on Ko-fi, or right here on YouTube through stuff like Super Thanks and channel memberships. And with that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.